Imagine a Persian spy, belly pressed against the sun-scorched rocks of Mount Kalidromos, looking down at the narrow strip of land known as the Hot Gates. It is 480 BC, and the largest empire the world has ever seen is about to swallow the small, fractured collection of cities called Greece. The spy expects to see an army in a panic. Men sharpening blades with trembling hands or praying to silent gods. Instead, he sees something so bizarre he thinks he's hallucinating. Below him, the Spartans are naked, sitting in the dirt, calmly oiling their skin and carefully combing their long, flowing hair. The spy sprints back to King Xerxes, the king of kings, who sits upon a golden throne. He reports that the Greeks are acting like women at a spa. Xerxes laughs. He thinks they are insane. But standing next to him is Demaratus, an exiled Spartan king. He doesn't laugh. He whispers a truth that turns the king's blood cold. The Spartans only fix their hair when they know they are about to die. What you saw was a funeral rite. Those men aren't planning to survive the week. Welcome to the story of Thermopylae, not the Hollywood version but the grit, the geography, and the brutal mathematics of the most famous last stand in history. To understand why this battle happened, you have to understand the law. The 300 Spartans were never supposed to be at the pass. In Sparta, it was the season of the Carnia, a sacred religious festival where warfare was strictly forbidden. To march an army during this time was a crime against the gods, punishable by death or exile. The Spartan government, the Ephors, refused to mobilize. They told the rest of Greece to wait for the full moon. But King Leonidas was a realist. He saw the smoke of the burning northern cities. He knew if he followed the letter of the law, there would be no Greece left to defend. So he found a loophole. He couldn't take the Spartan army, but he could take a personal bodyguard. He handpicked 300 veterans, but he added a requirement that proved this was a suicide run. Every man had to have a living son back home. Leonidas wasn't just building a tactical unit. He was ensuring that when these men died, their names and bloodlines wouldn't vanish from the earth. When he left his wife, Queen Gorgo, she didn't ask him to come back safe. She was a Spartan. She knew the odds. She asked for his final orders. He didn't say, "I love you." He said, "Marry a good man and have good children." He was already a dead man. The moving supercity. They marched north to the Hot Gates, a narrow pass where the limestone cliffs of Mount Kalidromos crash into the Malian Gulf. There, they joined a coalition of about 7,000 other Greeks, Thespians, Thebans, and Phocians. It sounds like a formidable force until you look at what was coming from the east. Xerxes was bringing a force so large it was a moving supercity. Modern estimates put it at 200,000 combat troops, plus a massive train of support staff. This army didn't just march. It reshaped the planet. Xerxes had spent 4 years preparing. He dug a canal through a mountain just so his ships wouldn't have to navigate a dangerous corner. He built a bridge of boats across the Hellespont, paving it with soil so the horses wouldn't panic at the sight of the ocean. They drank entire rivers dry as they passed. Now, they sat camped on the plains of Trachis, their campfires turning the night horizon into a sea of flame. Xerxes waited 4 days. He was convinced the Greeks would run when they saw his numbers. They didn't move. Finally, frustrated, he sent a messenger to the Spartan line. The messenger didn't offer terms. He simply pointed at the massive Persian host and gave a command, "Lay down your weapons." Leonidas, standing before his 300 fathers, shouted back the 2 words that would define the Spartan spirit forever. "Molin Labe. Come and take them." On the 5th day, Xerxes lost his patience. He ordered the assault. But Leonidas had chosen his ground with the precision of a surgeon. In the ancient world, geography was destiny. Back then, the coastline was much tighter than it is today. The pass was a bottleneck only about 50 feet wide at its narrowest point. This was a force multiplier. In military theory, if you can control the space, you can nullify numbers. In a 50-foot gap, a massive army is paralyzed. The Persians couldn't flank the Greeks. They couldn't use their cavalry or their chariots. They had to funnel their vast ocean of soldiers into a tiny stream. This meant that at the point of contact, the odds weren't 200,000 against 7,000. It was 100 Persians against 100 Greeks. And in a fair fight, the Spartans were the most dangerous men alive. The Persians were designed for speed and mobility on the open plains of Asia. They wore light linen armor and carried wicker shields. The Greeks were hoplites, named after the hoplon, a 20-pound shield made of wood and bronze. When they stood in formation, the shield covered the left side of the bearer and the right side of the man next to him. They were a bronze wall. When the first wave of Medes slammed into the Greek line, the sound was like a car crash. The Greeks used the oismos, the great shove. The back rows pushed into the front, driving the bronze wall forward like a bulldozer, crushing the breath out of Persian lungs. The Spartan spears, the dory, were 9 feet long, while the Persian spears were shorter. The math was brutal. The Persians were dying before they could even reach the Greeks. It wasn't a battle. It was industrial slaughter. Xerxes, watching from his golden throne, jumped to his feet 3 times in terror. He saw his worldview collapsing. He sent in his immortals, the elite 10,000 who were the emperor's personal shadows. They were called immortals because their strength was never allowed to drop below 10,000. If a man died, another instantly replaced him. They marched in silence, their faces hidden by cloth cowls. But even the immortals hit the bronze wall and shattered. The Spartans even toyed with them, performing a feigned retreat. They would turn their backs and run like cowards, lure the immortals into a disorganized sprint, and then, at a silent signal, spin around in perfect unison and lower their spears. The momentum of the Persian charge was turned against them, and they ran straight into a forest of points. For 2 days the Greeks held. The Persian supercity was stalling. Xerxes couldn't wait forever. His army was eating through its supplies so fast the clock was ticking. If the Spartans held for another week, the Persian army would starve. The traitor and the final dawn. But history turns on the smallest of hinges. A local Greek shepherd named Ephialtes, hoping for enough gold to change his life, walked into the Persian camp. He told them about the Thermopylae path, a goat track that led through the oak forests high above the pass and dropped down behind the Spartan wall. Under the cover of darkness, Xerxes sent his immortals up the mountain. The 1,000 Phocian guards stationed there to protect the path heard the crunching of dry leaves, a sound Herodotus described as a roaring wind, and they panicked. They retreated to a hilltop to make a last stand, but the Persians simply ignored them and marched past, descending the mountain toward the rear of Leonidas's army. At dawn on the 3rd day, the scouts arrived at Leonidas's tent. "The Persians are behind us." The pincer had closed. Leonidas called a final council. He didn't demand a mass suicide. He ordered the majority of the Greek allies to retreat so they could live to defend their own cities later. But for a Spartan king, retreat was not an option. Spartan law was his master, and it commanded him to stay. However, the movies often forget who stayed with him. 700 men from the city of Thespians refused to leave. These weren't professional warriors. They were farmers and craftsmen. They had no law forcing them to stay, but they chose to die beside the Spartans simply because they believed it was the right thing to do. There were also 400 Thebans and hundreds of unnamed servants. Roughly 1,500 men stood in the gap as the sun rose for the last time. To dine in Hades, Leonidas looked at his men and delivered the ultimate dark humor. "Eat a good breakfast. For tonight we dine in Hades." They didn't wait to be attacked. They marched out into the wider part of the pass to meet the Persians head-on. They were no longer fighting to hold a wall. They were fighting for the body count. When Leonidas was struck down early in the fight, a biblical struggle erupted over his body. 4 times the Persians tried to drag him away, and 4 times the Greeks drove them back, piling the dead like a rampart to protect their king. As their spears shattered, they drew their short swords. When the swords snapped, they fought with their bare hands and their teeth. They were no longer soldiers. They were primal forces of nature. Xerxes, terrified to lose any more men to these blood-soaked madmen, ordered his infantry to pull back and sent for his archers. Thousands of arrows blotted out the sun. The last Greeks died huddled together on a small hill, buried under a storm of iron. The legacy of the 300. Xerxes eventually reached Athens and burned it to the ground, but he had already lost. The 3-day delay at Thermopylae had allowed the Greek navy to organize. A few months later, at the Battle of Salamis, the Persian fleet was destroyed. Without ships to supply his moving city, Xerxes had to retreat. Western civilization was saved by a 50-foot gap and a few hundred fathers who refused to move. Today, if you visit the hill of Colonus at Thermopylae, you can find a simple stone inscription. It doesn't brag about the number of Persians killed. Simply says, "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws we lie." They didn't die for glory. They died because they were asked.